everybody. My name is Hayley Mansfield. I'm the Executive Officer of ARC Justice, which incorporates the Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre. Welcome to this year's Talking Justice. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon where we're meeting tonight, the Dja Dja Wurrung, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge that age-old ceremonies that still commence on this, that still take place on this land, and the connection that the local community, Aboriginal community here in Bendigo have to the land and the care that they've taken for many years. So Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre started Talking Justice in 2014, and we aim to create an environment where the local community can come and talk about issues that are affecting our society, and we're hoping that through these events people can hear different sides of different issues and take a little bit away that will inform their opinions and decisions and hopefully their advocacy on certain issues. This year we're really excited to be partnering with Bendigo Library. We have hosted this event for the last 3 years, and this is our first year doing it in partnership with the Bendigo, with the Goldfields Library. And we're hoping throughout 2018, 2019 to be bringing sessions every few months. But I'm just here tonight to do a little bit of housekeeping. My job tonight is very short and to introduce our MC. So John McPherson is the principal of the local law firm Arnest Ellis McPherson. He's a director of the Law Institute of Victoria, Victoria State Committee member of the Australian Lawyers Alliance, and I think most importantly, he is a volunteer for the Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre and has been for many years. John is also an extremely strong champion for Talking Justice and really appreciative of him being able to give his time tonight. I'm really excited about the panel. I'm going to be taking a back seat and going and having a listen, and welcome John.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the first session of Talking Justice for 2018. Talking Justice, as Hayley has explained, is a program of ARC Justice, the body that runs the local Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre. And this is the 5th year that the program has run during Law Week. Again, as Hayley has already acknowledged, ARC is delighted to partner this year with the Goldfields Library. I too wish to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the ground we meet on, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. I also particularly welcome any other Indigenous people and elders here with us tonight. Once more, as you already know, my name's John McPherson. I'm a solicitor locally here and also have a little to do with the CLC. I'm really pleased to introduce this evening's speakers, and we'll do so very briefly right now, asking our 3 guests, Kate Wright, Moira Rayner and Badham, to come to the stage. Please welcome them. Given the nature of the topic under discussion tonight, the Me Too movement and its wider social implications, I do ask very sincerely that all of us make an extra effort to speak with each other respectfully and keep the atmosphere in the room calm. We are doubtless joined by survivors of sexual harassment, assault and serious sexual crime. Let's take care to avoid triggering survivors. The nature of tonight's event is oriented toward public and collective concerns rather than private and individual ones. I ask, therefore, that questions relate to broader community responses to these issues or how they might affect particular slices of the community. If there are folk here who have the need or wish to speak of individual experiences, I'm very pleased to say that we're joined tonight by people from 2 great local bodies, the Centre Against Sexual Assault and the Centre for Non-Violence, and they'll be able to speak privately at the conclusion of tonight's talks. You can find the CASA representatives at the CASA table. Again, if you need to speak privately, that can be facilitated. To be frank, I'm not entirely sure where the Centre for Non-Violence people will be found, but I would suggest that maybe they might be nearby to the car's a table outside, and I'm told that's so. This beautiful Baroque town hall in which we tonight gather has been the scene of some interesting meetings of recent times. Less than 3 years ago, on 29 August 2015, at a protest against a planned Bendigo mosque, a UPF member commenced a speech to many hundreds of people gathered just outside this room by quoting Adolf Hitler at length with approval. I truly never thought I would live to see such a day. Comically, perhaps, the quote was erroneous and apocryphal, but the explicit invocation of Hitler was nonetheless chilling. Talking Justice is on a whole other level. Talking Justice aims to bring critical thinkers and influencers to Bendigo to engage the community in discussions around justice. The program is guided by principles of respect, balance, diversity and accessibility. It promotes a culture of commitment to ongoing dialogue. It is non-partisan, although I think could say itself absolutely proudly anti-fascist. For a notion so closely associated with social media, it's noteworthy that the origins of Me Too can be found in a now practically defunct social media tool, MySpace, in 2006. It was there that Tarana Burke, an African-American civil rights activist from the Bronx, started the movement. A 13-year-old girl had confided in Tarana about her experience of sexual assault, to which Tarana replied, "Me too." It was a grassroots campaign promoting, quote, empowerment through empathy, and concerned to raise awareness about sexual harassment and abuse, particularly among women of colour and in underprivileged communities. Much more recently, in October 2017, news outlets in New York began reporting on serious allegations of serial sexual harassment, abuse and even rape concerning the Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. In turn, on the 16th of October 2017, after having read a flurry of articles about Weinstein, the actress and activist Alyssa Milano promoted a meme on Twitter which read, "If all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote, 'Me too,' as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem." In less than 24 hours, more than 1 million tweets featured the hashtag #MeToo, and by now it has appeared in 85 countries on Twitter on more than 10 million occasions. Tonight, using Me Too as a springboard, our speakers will look at issues surrounding sexual harassment, assault and more serious sexual crime from varied perspectives. They'll help us to situate these concerns within our specific local community, broader Australian society and even try to do it globally, to understand how these issues have been addressed historically and continue to be addressed within the feminist movement, and also to locate where this issue sits within local and global cultural change, perhaps with special reference to new media and new communicative modes. Our panellists, each in their own way, are uniquely placed to help us better understand Me Too and its relevance to us. Kate Wright, who will be our first speaker shortly, is the Chief Executive Officer of Loddon Campaspe Centre Against Sexual Assault. She brings a unique local perspective to our panel and a very hands-on experience in working with victim survivors of sexual assault. In her CASA role, Kate is committed to addressing the impact of sexual violence for individuals and their families and responding to the causal factors that contribute to its occurrence. In the past, Kate has worked around housing, alcohol and other drugs, place management and gender equity issues. Badham is a writer, commentator, activist, occasional broadcaster and theatre maker. A weekly columnist for The Guardian, Van is otherwise published widely in Australian news media and is a frequent guest on television and festival panels. Van's plays have been performed across the Anglosphere and widely in Europe, and she published her first novel in 2010. And I'm aware now, having spoken briefly to Van, she has today put online for her regular Guardian column an article about the recent tragic deaths in Western Australia. Moria Rayner is a lawyer. She's loomed large in Victorian law for all of my career. When I was a law student, Moira was the Commissioner for Equal Opportunity for Victoria. She's long been an active and engaged member of the Law Institute of Victoria, chairing the workplace relations section until earlier this year. I had the very great pleasure of meeting Moira when I was a student, when she came to my Carlton Street shared student residence to see her dear old friend, the late Lloyd Davies, a West Australian barrister and author, and the father of one of my friends and housemates. Moira's work nowadays mainly relates to workplace law. She is an author, an advocate for good governance, human rights and civil liberties. In the profile she supplied to Arc Justice, she charmingly noted that she, quote, follows Van Badham on Twitter, Ignatius of Loyola on Facebook, and tries not to be typecast. Please join with me in welcoming our three guests. And I'll hand over to Kate Wright.
Thanks, John. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting tonight and pay my respects to owners past and those that may be present. I'd also like to acknowledge that today is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersexism and Transphobia. And part of my work here tonight is to put this discussion into the broader context. And I think it's important to first look at the sexual assault and violence prevalence data in Australia. And this is just some fast facts. 1 in Australian women have experienced sexual violence and 1 in 20 men. 1 in 6 Australian women had experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. 1 in 8 people experience abuse, sexual or physical, before the age of 18. 50% of women experience sexual harassment and 25% of men. 15% of women had been sexually assaulted by a person they knew since the age of 15. 1 sexual assault is reported every hour in Australia. Family violence is the #1 killer of women aged between 15 and 44 years in Australia. And 1 woman is killed every week by her partner or ex-partner. Sexual violence is a large part of reported family violence and is often the last part that is disclosed. Nearly 19,000 women and 4,000 men experienced sexual assault in 2016, and that data is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Personal Safety Survey. It's also really important to note that sexual assault has had the largest increase over the last 5 years of recorded crimes against the person, eclipsing robbery, physical assault, murder and other crimes. The rate of sexual violence perpetrated in Australia has increased by 22% in the last 5 years. So, a bit about Loddon Campaspe Centre Against Sexual Assault. We began from the Rape Crisis Centre in 1974, which was formed by women who were all volunteers who sought to end sexual violence and support women that experienced it. In 1983, Bendigo Casa was the first rural and regional casa opened, and it began with 2 staff and volunteer counsellors. We now employ 25 staff. We are a partner in the Bendigo Multidisciplinary Centre and are co-located with the Victorian Police Sexual Offences and Child Abuse Investigation Team, Child Protection and Community Health. The MDC, the Multidisciplinary Centre, is a purpose-built facility with therapeutic counselling rooms, interview rooms and a forensic suite, which is currently used for adults that have experienced recent sexual assault. There are currently 6 MDCs across the state, and they're an overwhelming, fantastic approach to responding to people who've experienced sexual assault, and everyone is there that anyone would need to talk to at the right time. We provide counselling, support and advocacy for women, children and men. We also offer an after-hours crisis response to people that have experienced recent sexual assault. Last year, across our services and programs, we saw 1,000 clients. 3/4 of our clients are female and 1/4 are male. In response to the data that I've just talked about, I think as a community in Australia and locally, and our policymakers have responded with the media to address violence against women. It basically became too hard to ignore. The Family Violence Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse, and Me Too have all contributed to the public being informed and having a platform to be heard both formally and informally. As John mentioned, the Me Too movement was founded in 2006, went viral in 2016, and I have slightly different data to John because I believe that I think 18 million women have declared their experience using the Me Too hashtag on social media platforms. From our experience at CASA, we saw an increase in inquiries and referrals when Harvey Weinstein news broke, followed by Don Burke, Craig McLaughlin and Bill Cosby. Men with power and high profiles get the media attention, and there were headlines across all media formats in a sustained way. Thank you, Hollywood and the Australian media. It actually meant that we are seeing an increase in women who feel that they can actually ring and talk about something that may have happened to them. What we're also seeing is a backlash towards Me Too, and in that it is trial by media of the alleged perpetrators that women are tagging and naming in the media. I do not subscribe to this view. But, and there is always a but, what does Me Too mean for us as a community? Why couldn't all these women tell their story when it happened and seek support or justice? For years, when a woman disclosed or reported assault, the reaction has been one of victim blaming, both blatant and subtle. What was she doing there? What was she wearing? What did she expect? Things got a bit out of hand. Why did she take so long to tell anyone and come forward? These responses also occur within the justice system, particularly during cross-examination, where the presumption of innocence and to create reasonable doubt, the woman is diminished and dissected. She is of lesser character and therefore either caused or deserved the assault. This is evidenced by the Saxon Mullins case and the withdrawal of charges in the gang rape case in Geelong. These women experience the worst of our justice system and are both significantly impacted in a negative way. Let's not forget that in sentencing, the perpetrator's background or future prospects are used to reduce the consequences of their crime. He's a good bloke and full of promise. This contributes to why sexual assault and violence is so underreported. We know that a very small percentage of sexual assault cases are reported and an even smaller number go to trial. And of these, a smaller number result in conviction. It is gruelling, particularly for the woman. So what does this mean? How can we change things at an individual and community level? We have people in influential roles, politicians, magistrates, judges, commentators, that do not understand that sexual assault and violence is an act of power and entitlement. It is not a split decision to offend. It is underpinned by a belief that I am more powerful than you and I will take what I want. To impact on long-held beliefs and the system that support them, we need to challenge the status quo of inequality and address the gendered drivers of sexual violence. These include condoning of violence against women, men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence in public and private life, rigid gender roles and stereotype constructions of masculinity and femininity, and male peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women. And just listen to commercial radio to see that enacted every morning, afternoon and night. These issues around women, sexual violence and safety have existed for centuries. The viral Me Too movement has existed as we know it for 18 months. It has called out a few men that held powerful positions and have used this power to exploit those around them, particularly women. This is just the tip of the iceberg, as the data suggests. We need to ignore the Me Too backlash. We need to keep focusing on the main prize of gender equality, where women, children and men all live free from sexual violence. Thanks.
Now, we thought to just simply keep things rolling along rather than having questions on the way through, so I'll now call to the lectern, Moira.
Look, I thought I would just say my position really clearly in this case. I believe that the Me Too movement has been tremendously useful as a vehicle for understanding the idea of the rule of law. The rule of law is not about law and order. It is about the principle that every human being is equal in rights and dignity, and that the laws of this country apply to everybody equally without discrimination. And in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was actually developed with the active cooperation of an Australian called H.V. Evatt, a great man who descended into sadness afterwards, was a tremendous champion of human rights, as was Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of the United States President at the time, who helped to bring it about. But what we need to be very clear about is the fact that that principle, which is stated at the very beginning of the preamble, is where we should focus on the rights and responsibilities and how society should respond in Australia to the Me Too sexual harassment, sexual assault culture that has been so vigorously exposed in recent years. The Universal Declaration says recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and something else in that, and peace. Oh yeah, peace in the world. That, and this is relevant to our other things, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and it may be necessary, if not dealt with, for such barbarous acts to be met with rebellion against tyranny and oppression. Therefore, that's the basis on which we should look at how to respond to the onslaught of evidence that sexual misconduct is happening and has always happened, but now we're talking about it throughout our world forever, and it does grave harm. I say to you that the gravest harm of the Me Too response is everybody taking a narrow view of what it means. The rights to equality of opportunity, for example, and to equal treatment are the reason why we have a few laws. One of the laws is I shall not be touched without my consent. It's universal throughout the entire human race. And another of the laws is that I must give consent before I'm engaged in sexual activity at an age and circumstances when I can understand what that is about. And trouble is that some of the cases we've had have caused us to fall back into a protection from abuse focus, which is actually different. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be protecting women and particularly children of both sexes, and men too, from the misuse of power along with so-called sexuality for reasons that are damaging and destructing to the individual. I'm saying that if we simply focus on abuse as the problem, then we don't deal with the fundamental issue, which is equality, and the right to dignity and respect is a fundamental source of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I don't need to spell out for you the many opportunities we've had in the last few years to realise that Australia is no great leader in that regard. But I do need to say that this is what we need to focus on. The Me Too movement, I was one of the many, I'm sure, the millions who signed up when the Harvey Weinstein allegations became obvious, are rights. Respect rights. And respect the fact that the person who has the courage or the desperation to go public with what has happened with somebody who's misused their public power deserves to be supported when that experience has been shared in our own selves. We don't actually deal with that principle terribly well in any country. But in Australia, we do have anti-discrimination and equal opportunity laws. And we make money, I do, out of trying to get employers in particular to take the ultimate responsibility to make sure that these sorts of misuses of power and relationships of dominance and inequality are discouraged and, where discovered, stopped. And if necessary, the person or the institution which is responsible for it is removed from any position of privilege. In our anti-discrimination law, we say that sexual harassment and sexual discrimination, I'm saying sexual, you'll note, not just sex discrimination, in employment, in education, in access to places, in goods and services, partnerships and the like, are all public activities in which the law has the right to say something. But I'm a lawyer, and I know how badly the law deals with people who have been able to voice what's happened to them years after the event sometimes, and to name it for what it is, this abuse of power. And we do it really, really badly. The very first case which led to the need for sexual harassment laws, for example, arose from the fact that the then head of a Department of Social Security, or something of that kind, was outed as somebody who was partial to taking young, new public servants into his confidence in his private room where he dropped his DAX. These sorts of things had been known, talked about, discussed, but somebody actually managed to get it into a court. And at this point, it became an argument about the law. How could this possibly be a crime? The person hadn't been sexually assaulted, and discrimination law did not apply. And that's why we have laws which specifically say that to make a sexual remark or a sexual advance or a sexual request and any other activity of a sexual nature is unlawful because, and if it is, the fact that the person subjected to it is insulted, humiliated, or intimidated. Very simple law, really, which requires an acknowledgement that the personal response of the individual may vary from one to another, but the wrong that is done in the presence of other people or in a workplace or public environment is a very serious wrong. Now, we have moved the idea of sexual harassment from simply sexual assault to a sexually permeated and hostile atmosphere. These are equally inclined to keep people out of, women in particular, but not just women, out of the enjoyment of public activity. But what we have revealed over the last few months is the full extent to which people of high prominence, lots of money, a hell of a lot of influence, have been getting away with sexual assaults for decades in our own lifetimes because nobody said anything, and because the law is a clumsy instrument for changing those sorts of attitudes, and because when it comes to people who are bullies and have enormous power, nobody wants to put their head up. Now, most of the work that I do deals with bullying, often of a sexual nature, but it's a bullying culture in which everybody feels vulnerable. So what you see happen to one person or hear about happen to another person is going to make you vulnerable too. You don't want to get caught as well. What I find unsatisfactory is that, and I do this for a reason, is that when public remarks are made and assumptions are made in a public place, that if the allegation is made, then the person is guilty and must be punished, is an undermining of that fundamental approach. Because it is important to name it and important to support it, but it does not mean that there is a criminal response. That is properly left to a court. But it does mean that we must deal with the circumstances, the power imbalances, the codes of silence, and more often than not, the male misuse of authority over women and other vulnerable people who are not necessarily women. It's something that we have to address as a culture, as a civilization, and as a community. So I support the Me Too, but as a person who in my own time have been accused of grave wrongdoing and been spat at in the streets and accused of being a very bad person, in another state, of course, it would never happen in Victoria, I know how easy it is to get a feeling of self-satisfaction when you point to the other person and say, you're a bad person, it's individualised. Or you're a bad organisation because it happened in your organisation, without understanding the whole thing comes from this attitude that powerful people can get away with anything because no one wants to stand up and back an ultimate victim. It's a bit like not really wanting to have anything to do with a person who's got a disability or a chronic illness or a disfiguring illness because somehow that's bad luck for you. That's the basis that we have to get over. I would like to point out that the high-profile cases we've got so far have been very, very serious ones. Jimmy Savile, who was a paedophile and a rapist, got away with it all his life and died and hopefully went to hell because he was so famous. They actually gave him access to vulnerable young children. Rolf Harris. Now, this is a mixture here. He actually copped all the blame, in my opinion, that Jimmy Savile deserved and didn't get in his lifetime, and had a thoroughly unfair trial, but he brought it on his own head by being a dirty old man, a sleaze bucket, a sexual harasser, well known for it. Nobody said and did anything. There's a shared responsibility for what he got away with, and the fact that he had, in my view, a thoroughly unfair trial because of the similar fact evidence was brought in that was subsequently found to be highly prejudicial and nothing to do with his general mode of behaviour, which he was a groper and a fumbler and a hounder. And he had an affair with his daughter's best friend. That's not a person who is actually using his position, as he did, to sexually harass girls and young women in the ABC in Perth. I remember that one, and a few when I was working in Perth, and those sorts of things. But also that fellow Dr. Nasser, who persuaded generations of gymnasts that digital penetration by him during medical treatment was actually medical treatment and had nothing to do with his personal desires. They've just paid out something like $58 million to a number of those women in just one university where he was running rampant. All of these things are terrible crimes, but our focus must be on the rights and the response to a person who says that my rights to bodily integrity and to be believed have been overruled. There is, I think, an important lesson for us in all of this. When somebody says a bad thing has happened, we need to believe that that is their experience, and we need to have a humane and empathetic response to that person. And we need to be aware now, it's factually established, that these things happen in the sorts of environments where privilege is sustained by silence. I have recently read an article by Helen Dale, or Helen Demidenko as she was known. Remember her? She wrote The Hand That Wrote That. She actually writes really, really well. That's why I follow her as well. She's not as good as Badham, of course. But she recently published an article in Penthouse in which she said that sexiness is not sexual harassment, and makes a strong argument that though it is true that people such as the, in her words are lovely, genetically manipulated monster, I can find that in just a minute, of Harvey Weinstein, he called a genetically engineered cane toad. There, that's right. The sort of man who wouldn't actually get women to agree to have sex with him unless he said, "I'll ruin your career if you don't." Those sorts of people have always been with us, and we can deal with those so long as we are supporting them. That is, the people, a proper process for addressing them. But she says that if there are women who are not offended by that sort of sexual conduct, women whom she thoughtfully described as are willing to dirty their knees, should not be slut-shamed, and that those women who don't find it offensive should be quite happy if that sort of conduct and what we now know as sexual harassment, that was a gun, was it? Should actually be allowed to do so, and workplaces where everyone agrees that's nice should be allowed to have it. All I can say to you is go back to the first principle, the human right to be treated as a human being of equal respect and value, a person who has a right to equality of treatment, and a person who doesn't have to put up with this shit. And if just because you like it and you're going around flirting, and one of my young proteges has been doing this for a year and a half in her new job, and she says, "Oh, it's our work, it's our workplace, nobody else is affected." So she had a barrage from me, which I'm now going to share with you, which is, I don't care that you like it, I don't like it, and all the other people that don't say anything and sort of snigger and leave the room, they don't like it either. Right, 2-minute warning. That's a good message there. Take it as your responsibility to do something about it. Don't laugh at the dirty jokes. Don't look away when there's something going on that makes somebody uncomfortable. And if you, like me, are not offended by anything, because I have seen everything pretty well, I think, except a total war, it doesn't matter. Think about the effect it's going to have on another person. Now, you've heard in the very first speaker the damage that sexual misconduct does to vulnerable people. And I have, in my 46 years of legal practice, I know it's hard to believe, I look so young, I have on several occasions acted for men who have also been sexually assaulted, subjected to very offensive sexual behaviour, all by other men, I might add. And I know the harm it did to them, who weren't prepared to mention it at all because that would be weak, or they wouldn't be believed, or they'd be thought to be gay, or some other terrible, terrible thing. It's much too frequent, this sort of stuff. I have, as a result of those experiences, concluded that I'm right, which I frequently do, but that avoid protecting the vulnerable, assert the rights of all. And that is a responsibility that everybody has, me too.
We now have our third speaker. Van has come today from the second best country central Victorian gold mining town, Ballarat. Let's welcome Van.
I've only just learnt about the Bendigo Ballarat square-off and have made the tragic error of complimenting both cities to the other population and have taken my punishment as due. Obviously, I'd like to pay my respects to the Djadjawarrung people. I'm always aware of the fact that in this beautiful country, I stand on Aboriginal land, a land that was stolen, never ceded. And I think certainly in the context of talking about justice, we must framework all of our conversations about what we consider to be fairness, what we consider to be rights, what we consider to be equality, on the shadow of the genocide that took place on the land that we inhabit. And to everyone here who is Indigenous tonight, I pay my humble respects to your custodianship of a land that I live on and love so much. Now, because I was just going to do questions, but I've decided to read a few love letters because I'm in the media, which is not what I meant to do with my life. I went to drama school. I'm supposed to be doing something very different. But I'm in the media and I get lots of love letters from fascists. And being in Bendigo, I thought I'd say big hello to the 5 angry boys and their friend who dogged this place so unfairly for so long. Because last year I did, as I am wont to do, I did a fundraiser for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. Community organisation, obviously has to seek charitable funds to support the asylum seeker and refugee community in Melbourne. And it was literally the most morally positive thing I think I've ever been involved in was taking phone calls in a telethon to say, can you donate some money so we can buy food, blankets and warm clothing for these refugees to survive the Melbourne winter. I don't think that's particularly arguable. If you don't want to give money to that cause, don't call in. But I did a little video promoting the event, like they asked all of the telethon participants to do, and I was targeted by a fascist organisation or group on the internet. I put, calling them organisations is a bit aspirational. And I'm going to read out some of the love letters, and the language is terribly, terribly bad. But just so you know, I gave this in evidence to a Senate inquiry recently and had the pleasure of being the first person to commit these words in this particular order to the Hansard. You are a dumb bitch, you're going to get gang raped by a group of refugees, then get decapitated, lol. She can't get a dog to please her. You belong in an oven. They think I'm Jewish. Dumb as fuck, kill yourself. I'm so looking forward to seeing her in her next video and demonstrate it on herself how female genital mutilation works. Bend over for some diseased anal before your throat is cut, dumb shit, self-loathing hater of your parents. That fucking makeover sure went south. Fuck, at least that Sheila with the tea-towel and glasses, Abdel McGilla Magoo, is a better sort. I believe in nothing she says, but I'd give her one just to spread a few more Christian tadpoles. I don't entirely think that's what Jesus had in mind, but never mind. She eats cut clit cereal. And why doesn't she put them up in her house where they can trash it and rape her and then stone the whore to death? I got 400 of these in 24 hours. 400. And I lovingly filed them all and did as I was wont and went down to the police station to make a report about the fact that people had threatened my bodily safety and my life. And the police are very nice, and I have a file, and they collect all of my love letters. And what's amazing about these is they actually have the names of, they're from Facebook. They have the names of the people who wrote them on them. But the police didn't pursue them, they didn't investigate them, and my relationship with the police is very positive. I like to think I'm compiling a paper trail just in case one of these gentlemen does rape and kill me, so maybe if something particularly serious happens, we'll all have a place where we can look. But as it turns out, and as I've discovered since, there are actually 5 laws in the state of Victoria that absolutely affirm my right not to be subjected to these kind of threats and this kind of hate. 5 laws. And yet it's an issue around the awareness of the police, the preparedness of that particular justice system to take action on my behalf, which is failing somebody like me in this circumstance. I'm going to tell some more stories. My friend Susie is a brilliant lawyer. She won the University Medal in Law and Government. At a very young age, she was headhunted by an international merchant bank to go and run their banking acquisition department in their London office. This was an extraordinary opportunity for a young Australian woman, and she was unbelievably good at her job. Imagine her horror at the Christmas party that she was obliged to attend when her boss gave a speech discussing the achievements of the department over that year and made particular point of remarking on just how appealing he found her breasts. Now I'm going to translate the following discussion, which was in front of everybody she worked with, into Australian because obviously my English accent is not convincing. You know, we've welcomed a lot of people to the department this year, but my personal favourite has got to be Susie because I just love staring at her fantastic breasts. Susie, I think I speak for all of us here when I say we all regret you're married because any of us would like to give you one. Do Australian men have big dicks? Because a lot of Australians descend from the Irish and we all know what they were like. Or is he British like us? Ha ha, you know what I'm saying. But seriously, of all the women in this department, you're the one I'd masturbate first. Not exactly encumbered with a sense of honour, she decided to leave, picked up her jacket, at which point her boss chased her across the room and said, "You can't leave, you're covered in wine." This was, of course, his cue to pour wine over the top of her head, and when she removed her jacket in order to get the wine off herself, he grabbed her breasts in front of her entire department. Now, the Monday after this particularly traumatising, humiliating episode, all done with under the mantle of a good night out with the department, she went to see Human Resources in her building to ask that either she or the boss be transferred out of the department. Our working relationship is not practical. She had written a deposition, she was very clear about what happened, and she felt unsafe, unappreciated, and unable to do her job. "What do you expect us to do about it?" said HR. My friend was also in a situation where what had happened to her was illegal, but she was put through a process of reconciliation where she found herself in situation with the boss, attacked and harassed by other staff for daring to make a complaint, and finally frozen out of her department to the point where they were essentially trying to bully her into a position where she could know that she would quit her job. She did successfully sue them, and she took them for a lot of money. But the damage to her career, her mental health, her marriage, and her understanding of her place in the world was permanent. Again, this was illegal. My friend Bethany, in her 20s, a drama student with a whole life ahead of her, full of joy and positivity, one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life, did what Bethany habitually is known to do. And when she saw a car broken down on a long stretch of freeway between Wollongong, where she went to university, and Sydney, where she lived, she pulled her car aside, got out of the car and offered assistance. When the guy with the car that was broken down intimated that she really should get into his car, that would be the best place for her to phone the NRMA, something in Bethany switched. She knew that there was a problem. She did not trust the man, and she sensed a trap. She ran for her car, she drove back to Sydney, and she made a report with the police about what had happened. Many months later, Bethany found herself as a witness in a court case where the accused man, who she recognised and could identify in a lineup, was being prosecuted for the sexual assault of somebody he had entrapped in a similar way. It was on the witness stand where Bethany, who had not been attacked, who was not the person who was pursuing the action, who had merely done her civic duty and given those very important details to the police, found herself being cross-examined. Cross-examined with questions about her own sexual behaviour, about whether she had flirted with the man who had tried to trap her by the roadside, where intimations were made that she was a woman of loose virtue and loose character. Her experience was so poisonous that she said to me that she could not understand how any woman who had survived a genuine sexual assault would feel confident in pursuing justice through the justice system. Lauren, 21, volunteering on a political campaign, meets a young man who invites her to spend time with him. It is all very consenting until it isn't. She is pinned to a bed, she is punched, wrestled and bitten, she is terrified and she freezes, she is raped. When she believes she is safe and no more harm will come to her, she leaves, she goes to the hospital, she completes a rape kit and she takes photos. She reports the entire incident to the police. She does everything that women are told to do in a scenario of sexual assault. But 2 years later, the police are not pressing charges because they do not believe there's enough evidence to convict the young man. So here's a bit of a variety of stories, all of which contextualise what we are not getting in this country about the very serious obstacles that stand between women and justice. And in the context of the discussion where we're being told that there's a necessary backlash to Me Too, how absolutely unfair it is for men to constantly check the idea that they might in fact be targeted by a false accusation, I am trying to get my head around why anybody would think that women would put themselves through the excruciating process of trying to seek justice in this country if they were going to the trouble of falsifying a claim. I'm not saying that there are not people who manipulate the justice system in their own interest, but I am saying that we have a justice system that is not serving the interests of women when it comes to sexual assault, violence, harassment, and other forms of gendered crime. We have a justice system that does not actually position women at the centre of the justice process or even invite them into a discussion about what justice might or should look like for them. And this is a very important conversation for us to have, because while Me Too has been amazing for people like me and my friends, our experiences of sexual harassment, assault and direct violence being able to be aired in the great act of collective de-shaming, we are in a horrendous twilight in Australia between an awareness of the problem, its solution, and the murky world of injustice in between them. We can have the conversation about the fact that we know that violence against women is not caused by psychiatric illness. It is not caused by criminal recidivism. It is not caused by substance abuse. It is not caused by broken childhoods. Consistently, studies have shown us that violence against women by men is caused by a very distinct set of values that define masculinity as superiority and control, and femininity, what it means to be female, to be passive, to be weak, and to be owned as property. This is what we know. This has been borne out in international studies across many nations, this consistent pattern of behaviour. It is not feminists who think all men are rapists. It is rapists who think all men are rapists. And we exist in a community where messages that come through our most powerful institutions of the law, of politics, of the media are framed in such a way to maintain this paradigm that women are weak and men can be exonerated for the things that we do. And while we're looking at what does justice look like, we've got to recognise that we've inherited a justice system that is fundamentally prejudiced against women. It was only in 1995 that the last set of laws were introduced in this country, in South Australia, to finally make rape illegal in marriage. 1995. In this state of Victoria, it was only 3 years ago, and due to the energetic campaigning of Victoria's sex worker community, that laws that allowed lesser rape sentences for rapists who raped women of less virtue were finally overthrown, and a certain amount of equality was found within the law. But while we have laws on the books and no willingness to prosecute them or to understand what solutions and remediation and justice looks like, we're going to be trapped in a situation where women are actively disincentivised for pursuing any kind of justice process in regards to what has happened to them. I want to know where is the question being asked of women, what do you want to resolve this process? Because when it particularly comes to issues around workplace harassment and family, domestic, intimate partner violence, these are the most important questions. What will it take for you to stay safe? It is not necessarily a payout. It is not necessarily a jail term. It is not necessarily a meted form of punishment. Overwhelmingly, women want processes in place that will get the harassment and the violence to stop. And until we can ask that question of women, how will you feel safe? What can we do? We are participating in a situation that keeps women trapped in roles, in positions, in workplaces and in homes where they are made vulnerable and they are deprived of their right to equality and safety in a community that's supposed to serve everybody. I just want to leave you with one more example of when we look at the situation around family violence and that ongoing question about why didn't she leave? Well, why did she have to? When a woman is being subjected to the perpetration of violence, how have we become a society that expects the victim to be the person who is deprived of their home, their security, their income, and their financial sustenance? Why is justice not in removing the perpetrator from the home and keeping that woman safe and supporting her through the financial security of being able to pursue the 7 different court judgments that she needs to protect herself and her children from abuse, with the safety of her home around her? Why is it that we still live in a community that is paying great attention to the experiences of victims and so little attention to their rights? Thank you.
Does anybody have a question?
In Australia, strict defamation laws where a claimant needs to prove beyond reasonable doubt that an allegation is true. In a he said, she said scenario, without corroborating witnesses, the high bar of evidence dissuades many claimants from making complaints. Is that true?
Is there a response from somebody on the panel as to the high bar that's set, I think, in the criminal law for complaints and the beyond
Yeah,
reasonable
look,
doubt
I'll make a
standard?
little comment. Well, I'll try. No, I just talk. Yeah, I'm talking about defamation. Criminal defamation is very rare, and that's the only time that proof beyond reasonable doubt is required. Usually it's the balance of probabilities. That's point one. But there is an offence of defamation. But if anyone can make a complaint to the police or to somebody inside an organisation you're working with or for, and you don't have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. But not being believed is a tremendous obstacle to pursuing it. And when I started practicing law, it was the norm when a woman made a claim that somebody was the father of her baby, for example. She had to provide corroborating evidence that she wasn't a lying prostitute. And that was the law at the time and had to be changed. So what we're looking at here is a whole range of ways of dealing with sexual offences where the person who has been affected by, from the worst kind to the equally worst kind but not regarded as so serious by judges. It depends entirely on the influence, on the effect on that particular person and how wounded they were before it all started. In those sorts of cases, we have to have a range of responsibilities. What we've found is the law is not adequate, and that the saying, yes, I know this happened to me too, story, and the identification of serial offenders like that dreadful Nassar doctor for the American Gymnastics Association, and various other things, are starting to be possible to be investigated without people saying, oh, you can't do that, they're too important. And that's what happened to Savile, Jimmy Savile. He got away with murder, literally, killing the souls of some of those people because the law wasn't adequate enough. So since we're talking about justice, we need to have civil remedies, mediated remedies, but most importantly, we had to be willing to believe that someone's experience is credible enough to be acted upon. It doesn't mean someone has to go to jail for it, but it does mean it has to stop. And it means that a person who has been damaged by this sort of stuff, and it can go on for life, and it can be permanent extinction. We've seen that through the Royal Commission into institutional responses to sexual abuse. We have to have a range of responses. None of them are going to be perfect. The best one is to prevent it. The only way to prevent it, in my view, is to pour a light on it and say, stop it. Stop it. I don't care how important you are.
And to support that, we had over 8,000 people come forward for the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses, and some of those people told people that never acted. And they never acted because they were intimidated by the power that the perpetrators held or the institution that they represented, and that's a gross misjustice for them.
Certainly, there's a campaign in Australia to reform defamation laws. The reality is that, because I get defamed all the time, like all the time. I think I get defamed in a News Limited paper today. My good friend Andrew Bolt has referred to me as a goose.
Oh, yes, I read that.
That poor boy at the Daily Telegraph has called me a bat. I was a pumpkin once, and you know, I'm a crazy communist and I'm going to destroy society and blah blah, cultural Marxism, feminazi, etc. I don't have the money to pursue a defamation complaint, even though the things that are happening to me are illegal. Defamation is entirely about, defamation law in Australia is entirely about protecting the privilege of the extremely wealthy to not be questioned or held to account. And there's a fundamental challenge for reform in this area, that once you enter public life, various precedents that do not exonerate you from defamation actions on the basis of wealth that do exist in other countries are things that many people are agitating for.
Another question out there.
Thank you very much. My question is around, I'd be interested in comments from the panel. In countries where there is more gender equity in senior roles and positions, so when there's more women in position of power and influence, so in terms of wages, community positions, you know, on boards, represented in leadership positions, does that have an impact on the prevalence of violence towards women?
Yes, it does. In fact, the Scandinavian countries that have had 40 years of legislated gender equity in these ways, not to mention a very generous parental leave scheme which is shared between the partners of a child equally, and you can apportion your bits of leave depending on what best suits your family's needs. Can you imagine how out there? They actually have the lowest rape rates in the world. So sexual violence hasn't been eradicated in those communities, but there's a massive distinction between the rates of sexual violence that are reported in the Scandinavian countries as opposed to somewhere like Malawi, where women's rights are incredibly limited. And in Malawi, the general social consensus is that women deserve to be raped. Certainly that was the case when I wrote about it a few years ago. And I think it's obvious, because all of the research confirms this, that these are, gendered contexts that these crimes exist within. And it is addressing the gendered context and the social messages that are communicated to potential perpetrators that does actually reduce the amount of that particular crime in any kind of community. You'll notice this week, in the wake of what happened in Margaret River, and this is what my article was about today, we saw a very interesting response to the events of what had happened, and obviously a coronial inquest is pending. The full details of what happened in Margaret River haven't been released by the police, although we know 7 people are dead, including 4 children. But automatically there was a media frame which developed describing the person who's been speculated to be the perpetrator as a good bloke. And it was very interesting that this framework, which has been used to describe men who coronial inquests did find murdered their families, actually came under, he was a good bloke, he just snapped, he was just under pressure. There was a terrible case a couple of years ago where it was like, oh, well, his wife had a disability and it was so hard for him. How hard for him to be the person caring for the person who had the disability. But this frame was challenged really quickly, and people like Juanita Phillips and Clementine Ford and Georgie Dent came out really strongly, and I wrote about this today, challenging that frame and going, well, this is just a way of making excuses and providing a context for an exoneration, and that forgiveness is an instant forgiveness for male perpetrators is actually faster than sympathy exhibited for female victims. And the idea that that discourse has been sort of challenged and is in the process of conversation does represent some progress, but it's a demand of being ever vigilant to sort of stomp on these old tropes that we go back to that constantly position women as being of lesser value and inferior as our social institutions sort of struggle to keep up.
Kate, do you have anything to add to what has been said by Van? Or?
Well, I just think with going back to the original question around gender equity, it's an important thing we have to look at is that it's not about the loss of something for men. It's actually raising the bar so that women have equal opportunity. And in the Scandinavian countries, Van mentioned around paternity, maternity leave, it's actually quite freeing for all genders to have access to the same thing in an equal way. So that does reduce the power imbalance. So there is no loss, it's actually a mutual gain. And I think in Australia, the message gets diluted that male entitlement is going to be reduced. So there is a loss, which is difficult for men to adjust to, rather than that there is going to be equal access. And I think that's the discourse that we constantly are having around empathy, which is the new term that's come up with talking about, that a perpetrator shouldn't be going to jail for 4 years because he's got a promising sporting career, and what's that going to do to it? And that there is an overwhelming, sense of empathy for perpetrators. And I think we've got to change that.
When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Moira, do you have anything to add to the relationship between institutional, social and economic power of women within a society and the prevalence of violence against them?
I was going to say the interesting thing about the Scandinavian response was their long tradition of communal responsibility. Interestingly, in the United States, women have done rather well in the upper echelons in many parts of business and tend to be paid sometimes even more than the blokes. But when you look at them, they didn't come from the working class and struggle the way up with their education opportunities limited by and their medical issues, etc., being things that couldn't be dealt with under the economic system in the United States. They often came up through what I rather unkindly see as the privileged status of being a well-familied woman, and somebody who's made it also through privilege. The horrible thing in Australia is that we've got neither the one communal responsibility or the two large numbers of successful women who've made it because they're well connected. What we have at the moment is a desire to see, for example, female directors of public companies that have cheated and lied and been corrupt and stolen, losing their jobs because they, of course, were incompetent because they only arrived there recently, while the thugs that have divided up their directorships freely amongst their mates, friends and second cousins get away without being called out for the total lack of merits they showed in the whole time they were on the public teat. And they are on the public teat because they are enjoying a tax exemption that are not available to others. I could go on.
I'm sure you could. But there'll be more questions, Moira, I reckon.
We've heard a lot today about gender equity, and I know that there's a lot of people and clubs and brigades and footy clubs in the region doing really great work around gender equity, and I just want to ask the panel, what are some of the practical day-to-day things that we can do in society, particularly men? What are some of the things that men can do around progressing gender equity?
Everyone, not just men, should check their gender stereotypes, and we all have embedded gender stereotypes that slip out. I think we need to actively be inclusive and really work at watching from the basic things of our language to actually the facilities, amenities and access that we all have. And it gets overlooked. It's often an agenda item, it's often an add-on. It's not actually embedded into our systems of how we work and how we think. So it's the consciousness of challenging our own embedded stereotypes.
I think one of the really positive things that men can do is to be proactive and preemptive about better standards. The most powerful conversation that can exist around gendered violence, gender discrimination is from one man to another, and affirming that sexist behaviour is not okay and that there are consequences for sexist behaviour of social exclusion and isolation. And men having that conversation with one another in male-dominated forums, within friendship groups, within sporting teams, within various other, workplaces and parts of the community is actually incredibly transformative for the other men who are part of that conversation. Like, if you want it to stop, take a leadership role. If somebody makes a sexist comment, they get one warning, they get called out, and if the behaviour is repeated, there have got to be sanctions and consequences for that. One of the problems we're having with the internet, as a person who, gets threatened and defamed and attacked every day, is the internet makes that kind of behaviour unseen. Whereas I know that we live in Australia, fortunately, where in many sections of the community, the kind of things that men say to me on the internet, their friends would be horrified if they said them in a public place. And it's maintaining that level of appropriate horror and that sense of consequence, which does actually powerfully instruct other people in how to behave. And I think that's something that all men should be aware of. The other thing too is, within a workplace, there are tools and resources that are available to you. For example, if you're a member of a union, you have unionised workers, you can bring in the union to talk about standards of behaviour and what is acceptable and not acceptable in that workplace in terms of the way that behaviour is enacted towards employees. You can enact policies in your workplace or your organisation that identify there will be consequences to that behaviour. Something that the way that we create safety is to establish the conditions of what safety looks like and expect people to respect them and to affirm them and to maintain them.
I agree in theory. I think it's fantastic, and I think all of those protections and systems exist. But if we look at the police force, the CFA, and all of the investigations into those organisations that are meant to be leading the way and demonstrating inclusion and good practices, they have been found to actually all been operating below the line with bullying, sexism, racism, and it's more than systems. I think you have to do both. I think you have to have the systems and the protections and the reinforcement of those, but on a day-to-day basis, we still really all need to be checking our behaviour, questioning our beliefs, and doing it vigilantly. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen because it's really hard.
I think there's a
Can I
point from
just say,
Moira.
I'm sort of itching to say something here. One is, there is hope. I've been training, and I'm increasingly training, the Metropolitan Fire Brigade in appropriate workplace behaviour and diversity for some time. And I train recruits and station officers, senior station officers and commanders. And they have themselves, I'm not just saying this, they have themselves realised they need to do more to deal with the human side of what their rules of conduct are about, how to get the personal skills to deal with these things coming up. And I've seen a huge change in the 10 years I've been doing it with my colleagues, because to begin with there was absolute opposition, and it's now developing in a slightly different way in spite of all the difficulties that are happening at the moment. So cultural change can happen, but it's bloody slow, that's all. It's just 2 generations, and we're not old enough yet.
On that point, Moira, at the time when you were admitted to practice as a lawyer, how many women were on the bench?
None.
None on the High Court?
None.
None on state Supreme Courts?
None.
I know for a sure and certain fact that there were none also on the Victorian Magistrates Court at that time.
At that time, yeah.
You're part of the cohort of women, second-generation feminists who were on a long march through institutions. Do you think that, and I suppose I'm still picking up, Claire, on what you just said, or inquired after, but do you think that the presence now of women in Victoria, I can speak of, on the County Court, the Supreme Court, Rob Hulls, when he was attorney, appointed more women to judicial office than all attorneys in 100 years of history before him. That's how bad it was. But do you think those institutional changes, Moira, have ultimate outcomes?
Women need to do law differently. I think a lot of women, and I include myself in this, did law like a bloke because you had to be taken seriously, which means you have to be tough. And so naturally you're forbidding and butch and all that sort of stuff. But in fact, I'm just doing what a male barrister did. When I went to the bar a long time ago, there were 2 women at the bar, me and one other. So, you know, we sort of knew that what we had to do was camouflage just ourselves a little bit. But I had a big awakening when I learned about domestic violence 30 years ago and realised that, no, you have to do it differently. And so did Mary Gaudron say that, the first High Court judge. She said she was sick of women carrying on the masculine adversarial model of legal practice and thinking you couldn't have children for the first 10 years of your legal practice or not at all because it wasn't appropriate for it. Change the bloody structure. That's what feminism's about. Change the structure. Yes, well, we haven't succeeded terribly well in that, actually, have we? It's a bit unfortunate. But look, you need to know, sometimes you need to just pick your parents well. I was raised by a feminist father who had been orphaned when he was just 16 years old, and he raised his younger brothers and sister and was determined that I would always be able to support myself and stand up for myself no matter what, because his mother just faded away and ended up dying of, I don't know what, melancholia, I think, something of that kind. So pick your parents well is a very good one, but be prepared for the long haul, which means, you know, get your sons and your daughters to understand it. And just a little anecdote. Last year, one of my dear friends, a meteorologist called Ian Bell, died. And at his funeral, I learned of all the things he had done in a gentle sort of a way to show men how to be different. I mean, he raised his own sons. He set up a knitting group for men. And they retained friendships for over 20 years, getting together and talking about issues of that kind. He modelled what it was like to be a working father in the days when this was absolutely unheard of. And looking at all the weeping people at that funeral, of which I was one, I realised that he'd actually managed to raise, sort of long distance and difficult circumstances, feminist sons as well. Men who understood the needs of women were the needs of human beings just like themselves, which is really what it boils down to, isn't it?
Thank you. More questions from the floor?
Can I just make the point?
Please,
if there's anybody in this room who is still not convinced that society is unequal, or anybody who's still perpetuating the mythology that, oh, you know, women have got themselves to blame, I'd just like to recommend you spend a day in the magistrate's court. Just sit there and watch the progression of cases that come through. Because when you see the nurse who gets harassed by the former patient, when you see the daughter who gets harassed by the father, the woman who gets harassed by her ex who's coerced his current partner into harassing her, the constant progression of stalking, hate, control, possession and manipulative behaviour, you will be disabused of any mythology that everything is fine and dandy in genderland.
I'd want to follow up a bit on what Van was talking about and also ask the panel what they thought about one of the issues with the internet these days. So I think it's clear from most of us that our system of justice is failing women in relation to getting some redress through the court system. You've got to be very brave and be very persevering. But just in relation to the internet, do the panel think that with the advent of modern technology, we've created a whole new brave world for the whole lot of us? Most of us here are older, there are some young people here. But we've got all this issue of young people being sexualised at a lot earlier age with texting or sexting one another, which wasn't around when I was a kid. And some of the stuff that you've experienced, Van, with people trolling or sending you these horrible sort of messages, this is fairly widespread with the aid of with the advent of modern technology. I mean, really, is this fostering a bit of a culture with younger people, do you think, of things that were never accepted in the old days and now sort of become commonplace? Does that make sense, a question?
Yeah, I sort of see where you're coming from. It's just a new way to do old, horrible things to women. And it's very important that we don't romanticise the old days. In the old days, you were the property of your dad until you were transacted to your husband, and you could be 12 when that happened. So I'm very aware of the fact that internet behaviour just exists in an established gender paradigm where traditional hatreds towards women are fostered in communities that exclude women quite deliberately, and certainly in the discussion around that horrible mass murder in Canada where the perpetrator identified as an incel or an involuntary celibate and was part of this horrific online community of men who just talk about how much they want to kill women because women are bitches all day. Certainly we're seeing different variants of some really old problems. And like anything else, like the technology is not to blame. Laurie Penny, who is, I flatter myself by calling her my British counterpart, she's somewhat more famous than I, wrote just the most extraordinarily brilliant essay recently. With the subheading, I think, was stuck with me, obviously, the title didn't, which was "The Internet Does Not Hate Women, Everyone Hates Women," and located what's happening online to traditional attitudes around the participation of women in public space. I'm very aware of the fact that I get so much garbage on the internet, and certainly I was on the drum on Monday night engaging in fairly innocuous conversations saying like such terrible things like maybe we should have more foreign aid, maybe people shouldn't murder their families, who knew, maybe we should build a hospital with all that money instead of giving it to the Commonwealth Bank. And I make a journey from the ABC studio to the airport, and I'd had about 1,000 men tell me I was ugly and stupid on that journey. And not a single one of them engaged with the substantive content of anything that I had said. The fact that somebody who is short, large-breasted and bogan was having, expressing a public opinion about politics, it's my phone, it knows I'm talking about it, was the actual problem, because for so many people that presence of a woman, or God help us a person of colour, or God help us a trans person or an intersex person or a person with a disability occupying a platform and claiming their right to public space, for people who were raised with a sense of supremacy and superiority, that's terrifying. You know, it wasn't so long ago in this country that you could wake up in the morning and all you had to do was be a white man, and the entire legal system, every social institution, every tradition reminded you with messages every day that you were superior, that you were in control of your destiny, that other people answered to you merely on the basis of the gender and identity into which you were born. And of course, being reminded that is no longer the case, for some people, they lost the only sense of agency they ever had. And while I'm not forgiving that, I think we do need to contextualise things within that tradition and do exactly what Kate says, continually check privilege, continually analyse systems, and continually put pressure on institutions to guarantee the safety of people and their right to equal participation.
I agree with what you've said, that the internet is a tool, but in the work that we do, we see the internet as a tool has provided access that has never been seen before to pornography. And the pornography that we are seeing is not the pornography of the good old days of, you know, man, woman, sometimes two women and a man. We are seeing people commissioning porn that is so bent and offensive that it's accessible. And it's accessible to children who are under 11, under 5, and we do see that it is a contributor to sexually harmful behaviours. There are 3 factors that we know contribute to that, and it's exposure to pornography, exposure to family violence, and having been sexually harmed yourself. And the internet has sped that up. It has made it really accessible, and that is not a good thing. And it's free. You don't have to pay. You don't have to sneak it. You don't have to, buy it in a brown paper bag. It is there and it pops up. So that, for me, is a really dangerous aspect of the internet.
Thank you very much, ladies, for your thoughts tonight. As a parent of 2 very young boys, being 7 and 5, I feel a real responsibility to have them grow up in an environment where they see gender equity, essentially. I'm a full-time working mum and find a lot of difficulties around that, and particularly around spending time with my children to reinforce that with them. I found a really valuable program that was run with my youngest son's kindergarten through the Centre for Non-Violence, where they tried to address gender stereotypes through a really non-intrusive setting where they wrote a book together, and it was an amazing experience for him and an amazing experience for me as a parent. And that book looked at a father figure that cooked dinner and washed the dishes and read the kids a story, and it was not reinforcing those women should be equal. It was about really validating the children's ideas about not gender stereotypes, but getting rid of those stereotypes and validating their sense of their own equity sense that they're living with. I just wondered if the panel could comment on the role of education, particularly early education, around generating those messages in the community for those children to grow up with, surrounded by an equitable environment.
So members of the panel, if you would like to address that issue of education, and also to perhaps, because we have run out of time, folks, to close off as you do so.
I think the best education you get from good relationships. And therefore, if parents do their job well and are parenting collaboratively and with respect for one another, whatever gender they are, whatever form their family takes, that's the best education, and most kids pick up their values from that. It's not school, it's family and peers. And that, to me, is why I've spent so much of my career actually promoting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The right of a child to information and to be raised in a family of love and loving family where they can fulfil their full potential as human beings seems to me the root of all things. This feels very simplistic, and probably I should be preaching from some sermon from some pulpit, but it just seems to me such a simple fact. If the relationships are good and the examples are sound, then that is the best chance we have of changing within a generation or two these dreadful imbalances that cause such dreadful harm.
Kate, do you have a particular perspective locally to bring to bear on any of this?
Well, I think, statewide in Victoria, the education department's rolling out respectful relationships, which on one hand I applaud and on the other hand I really question, because it's not given the time it needs and it's not being rolled out early enough, so that from preschool, which it is going to be rolled out, but it really needs to be supported so that we do see it being talked about at home, as Moira said, but also really supported in the education setting. And I think if we all live in a rich environment where there is no gender stereotype but equity is the norm, that would be very powerful moving forward.
Van, quite aptly, you have the last word.
Yeah, well, I think human beings are porous. Like, we absorb messages every day and we attach them to our values and we process them. And I look at someone like my dad. My dad came of age in the 1950s in a very conservative environment where there were very established gendered roles. Men were this, women were this. He wanted a son, he didn't get one. But I was born in 1974 at the time that the efforts of second wave feminism had made an encroach into media and communications and culture and the workplace and the schoolyard. And my dad picked those messages up. And my dad saw the posters that said girls can do anything. And that was the message that he needed to hear as a loving parent who was saddled with a girl who would never play football for New Zealand, that maybe my life could have some value and that he could be part of that. And I think that those kind of interventions in the classroom are incredibly important. I'd recommend everybody here check out a brilliant 2-part BBC show called No More Boys and Girls, which was about an educational researcher who went into a classroom on the Isle of Wight and degendered the classroom. And the experiences of going through this sort of degendering process, the kids communicated to their parents learnt something, that whole community was strengthened as a result. But my concluding remark would be not only to hold institutions to account and to remember that, you know, the letters you write, the conversations you have to the media, to the law, to the politicians, to the schoolyard, to the workplace do actually have an effect on people. But I am freezing to death and I have not worn my jumper specifically to communicate this message. This T-shirt is from the Women's Legal Service in Queensland, a community legal service obviously for women, overwhelmingly represent women in vulnerable situations, situations vulnerable to intimate partner and domestic violence. And they had their funding threatened, like a lot of community legal services. And so they ran this campaign saying, we have to sell T-shirts so we can protect women in legal cases. And they did get their funding because it was so embarrassing, but you can still buy a T-shirt. And every time you do, you are supporting an absolutely crucial service for women who live in some very isolated situations in Queensland. So I have given myself pneumonia specifically to carry that message.
So that's nearly all, folks. I would be very derelict to not acknowledge the great effort that has been put into tonight by Hayley Mansfield, Nicole Smith and Steve Walmsley from ARC Justice. I think it'd be premature for me to do the one Antonio Samaranch and declare this the best talking justice ever. But so far so good, Hayley. I think you're getting there. Can you join with me one more time to thank our tremendous guests for their time?